It's April 20th, 1984. The wind is howling across Everest's west ridge as Hristo Prodanov radios to base camp in triumph. I'm on the summit. The 41-year-old Bulgarian metallurgical engineer has just broken an Everest record and achieved the impossible. But within hours, that triumphant voice will turn to desperate whispers. Trapped on a tiny ledge 28,000 feet up, with fingers so frostbitten they can barely work, Hristo sends transmission after transmission, begging for rescue. His teammates could hear the desperation in his voice, the howl of the mountain, the freezing cold that was slowly stealing his life away. Then, at 7:45 p.m., they heard something that would haunt them forever. One final click of his radio transmitter, and then complete silence. From a poor kid in Bulgaria to becoming an Everest legend to one of the most heartbreaking final transmissions ever recorded. Today, I'm taking you inside the story of the Everest SOS that no one can answer. And I have to warn you, it gets much darker than you might expect. Welcome to the extreme edge. Quick question. What's the most dangerous way up Everest? Most people point to the Khumbu icefall with its collapsing seracs, or they'll say the death zone, that thin air world above 26,000 feet where your body slowly shuts down. But if you'd asked mountaineering experts in 1984, there was only one clear answer: anywhere on the West Ridge direct. The climbing world nicknamed it the Cruel Way, and once you understand what climbers face on this route, you'll see why that name is almost an understatement. Because imagine trying to balance on a jagged ridge for 4 miles while hurricane-force winds try to knock you off. Impossible, right? Well, that's the West Ridge Direct. The route forces you to do grade 5 difficulty rock climbing that would challenge elite climbers at sea level, except this time, you're doing it at 28,000 feet, where your brain is literally dying from oxygen starvation. But it gets worse. Most Everest routes give you some shelter, a couloir here, a protected ledge there. The West Ridge Direct offers nothing. You're completely exposed to winds that barrel across the Tibetan Plateau at over 100 miles per hour, or about 160 kilometers per hour. Climbers describe it like being on the wing of an airplane that's trying to shake you off. Meet Hristo Prodanov. Born in 1943 in Karlovo, Bulgaria, Hristo was born into a family that had absolutely nothing. His father worked whatever jobs he could find. His mother kept house. They were the kind of poor where every penny mattered, and dreams were luxuries they couldn't afford. Most kids would have accepted their fate: factory work, quiet lives, never looking up at the mountains. But at 15, Hristo was already developing what would become a lifelong obsession. Tiny detour on this chaos train. If you'd like to be a part of the extreme community, get early access to our videos and exclusive polls, come join us on Patreon. See you there. He spent every weekend in the Pirin Mountains, tackling technical rock climbs that most teenagers wouldn't attempt without ropes and safety gear. But Hristo was different. He had this obsessive need to understand every hold, every route, every risk. While his friends were figuring out what to do with their lives, Hristo already knew he was going to climb. By his early 20s, Hristo was working as an engineer by day, but his real life happened on weekends when he systematically began conquering Europe's most notorious routes. Between 1967 and 1977, he knocked them off one by one: the Walker Spur on Grand Jurasis, the Bonatti Pillar on Petit Dru, Mont Blanc's Freni Pillar, the North Face of Matterhorn. Each victory fed something growing inside him, a hunger that couldn't be satisfied by European peaks, no matter how dangerous. Then, in April 1981, Hristo did something that changed everything. He became the first Bulgarian to climb a 26,000-foot peak when he climbed Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain in the world, completely alone and without supplemental oxygen. And to tell you how impressive that was, most climbers even today wouldn't attempt Lhotse with a team and full oxygen support. When he came down from that summit, something had changed in Hristo's eyes. He'd gotten a taste of what it felt like to operate at the very edge of human survival, and he wanted more. For 3 years after Lhotse, Hristo couldn't stop thinking about going higher, pushing further into that zone where humans aren't supposed to survive. And in 1984, the perfect opportunity presented itself. See, Bulgaria was planning something unprecedented. This small Eastern Bloc country, tired of being overshadowed by bigger Soviet neighbors like Russia and East Germany, decided they were going to put their flag on top of the world. But they weren't taking the tourist route up Everest that was becoming crowded with wealthy Western climbers. No, they were going after the West Ridge direct. Yes, that same West Ridge route that had killed the French and barely been conquered by the Yugoslavs. The Bulgarian government was all in. This was going to be a national expedition that would show the world what their mountaineers could accomplish. They wanted to prove that Bulgaria had athletes who could compete with anyone. The selection process was absolutely brutal. Hundreds of Bulgaria's best climbers applied for just 24 spots on the team, and when the final team was announced in late 1983, 40-year-old Hristo Prodanov was named deputy expedition leader and put in charge of all technical aspects. His job was to plan the route, coordinate the placement of fixed camps, and ensure the safety systems that would keep 24 climbers alive on the most dangerous route on Everest. But even as Hristo sat in endless planning meetings, sketching out traditional expedition strategies with fixed camps and coordinated team ascents, Hristo had something else brewing in the back of his mind. Something his teammates would never have agreed to if they'd known what he was really planning. Because while everyone else was thinking like team players, Hristo was thinking like a solo artist. You see, while the rest of the team was preparing for a traditional siege-style expedition, the slow, standard type where you spend weeks moving supplies up the mountain, establishing camps, and slowly acclimatizing your body to the altitude, Hristo wanted something more. He was going to break away from the group and attempt the West Ridge direct solo, without supplemental oxygen, in a single push from the high camp to the summit and back. Today, this would be considered extremely dangerous, borderline impossible. But Hristo had run the calculations in his engineering mind. He'd studied weather patterns, analyzed his own performance data from Lhotse, and he knew his body could handle what others couldn't. He would move fast and light, carrying minimal gear, relying entirely on his skill and conditioning to get up and down before the mountain could kill him. The expedition launched in March 1984, and from the outside, everything looked textbook perfect. 24 of Bulgaria's finest climbers, 3 experienced Nepalese Sherpas, and enough equipment to siege the mountain for months if necessary. Led by veteran mountaineer Avram Avramov, they established base camp and began the methodical process of fixing ropes and establishing camps up the West Ridge direct. By early April, they had established Camp 1 at Lola at 19,850 feet, where they dug a snow cave large enough for 15 people. Camp 2 went in at 22,220 feet. Then, Camp 3 at 23,524 feet. Each camp was higher than most mountains on Earth. At Camp 3, just walking around left experienced climbers gasping for breath. But Hristo was thriving, while his teammates were struggling with headaches, nausea, and exhaustion from the altitude. He seemed to move around the higher camps like he was at sea level. His body, somehow perfectly adapted to conditions that would overwhelm most humans within hours, was operating like a machine built specifically for this environment. On April 18th, they established Camp 4 at 24,670 feet. The next day, Hristo and his guide, Sherpa Chawang Rinzi, pushed even higher, establishing Camp 5 at an incredible 26,640 feet, well into the death zone. That night, as Hristo lay in his sleeping bag at Camp 5, he made the final decision that would define his legacy. Tomorrow, he would attempt something that no human being had ever accomplished. So, at 4:30 a.m. on April 20th, 1984, Hristo and Chawang left Camp 5 in conditions that would have sent most climbers straight back to their sleeping bags. The temperature was hovering at temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin in under 2 minutes. The wind was howling across the West Ridge with gusts that could literally blow you off the mountain. But the weather was as good as it was going to get, and they both knew it. For the first few hours, they climbed together through terrain that defied description. Picture trying to climb a ladder made of ice while balancing narrowly on a path with 10,000-foot drops on both sides and hurricane-force winds trying to knock you into the abyss. That's what they were dealing with, except this ladder was nearly 2 miles long and angled at grades that would challenge expert rock climbers at sea level. Now, Choang was one of the most experienced high-altitude climbers in the world. He'd guided dozens of expeditions, seen every kind of weather and terrain the Himalayas could throw at him, but as they climbed higher on the West Ridge Direct, something started bothering him. The route was getting more technical, more exposed, more dangerous with every step. The rock was loose and crumbling, the ice thin and unpredictable. One wrong move would send both of them tumbling into the void. Around mid-morning, they reached a section where the climbing became so technical that Choang had to make a decision. He looked up at the route ahead, shook his head, and made the call that probably saved his life. He told Hristo he was turning back. Now, for most climbers, this would have been the moment of truth. Your experienced partner, someone who knows these mountains better than you ever will, is telling you the route ahead is too dangerous. The smart move, the safe move, would be to follow him down. But as Hristo watched Choang rappel away into the swirling snow below, something clicked in his mind. He thought about his childhood in that poor house in Karlovo, watching his father come home with blackened hands from working metal all day. He thought about all the people who had told him that kids like him didn't get to dream big. He thought about that moment on Lhotse when he'd proven he could survive in the death zone alone. This was his chance, not just to summit Everest, but to do something no human being had ever accomplished. The first Bulgarian on Everest. The first April summit in the mountain's history. The first person to climb the West Ridge Direct without supplemental oxygen. If he turned back now, he'd just be another climber who almost made it. So he did something that shocked even Choang. He said goodbye to his climbing partner and kept going. Alone, on the most dangerous route on the highest mountain on Earth. What happened over the next 7 hours was both miraculous and terrifying. Hristo moved up that knife-edge ridge like a man possessed, navigating technical sections that should have been impossible at that altitude. At 11:10 a.m., about 1,500 feet, or nearly half a kilometer below the summit, he managed to radio base camp, making steady progress on the West Ridge. The hours that followed were a nightmare of survival. Ice axes biting into frozen rock, crampons scratching for purchase on slopes that dropped into nothingness, all while winds threatened to tear him from the mountain. By afternoon, Hristo was still climbing the most difficult route on Everest, but somehow, impossibly, he kept moving upward. Then, at 6:10 p.m., came the transmission that made mountaineering history. He had done it. After 12 and a half hours of solo climbing on the world's most dangerous route, Hristo Prodanov was standing on the summit of Mount Everest. The first Bulgarian to reach the top of the world. The first person to summit Everest in April. The first climber to conquer the West Ridge Direct without supplemental oxygen. For 33 minutes, he stood on that tiny patch of snow and ice, 29,028 feet, or about 8,848 meters above sea level. He found a pyramid of empty Soviet oxygen bottles left by a previous expedition and tore off a piece of their flag as proof. He abandoned his 8mm camera after removing the film because every ounce would matter for what came next. But as Hristo began packing up to start his descent, something should have been gnawing at the back of his mind. Something that might not seem like a big deal if you're caught up in the euphoria of achieving your lifelong dream, but becomes absolutely terrifying once you really think about it. You see, the climb had taken much longer than anyone expected. Most Everest climbers start their summit attempts around midnight, timing everything perfectly so they reach the top by mid-morning and can get back down while there's still plenty of daylight. It's not just strategy, it's survival. But Hristo had started late and moved slower than planned through the technical terrain. Every pitch of difficult climbing, every moment spent figuring out the route, every pause to catch his breath in the thin air had eaten away precious hours. Hours that seemed meaningless when he was focused on just putting one foot in front of the other, now suddenly became the difference between life and death when you realize what's coming. It was now 6:40 p.m. as he started picking his way down from the summit. In the Himalayas in April, that meant he had maybe 30 minutes of usable daylight left, 30 minutes to cover the terrain that had taken him over 12 hours to climb. Now, if you've ever tried to retrace your steps down a hiking trail in fading light, you know how disorienting it can be. Rocks that were obvious landmarks on the way up suddenly look like every other rock. Paths that seemed clear in daylight disappear into shadows. You start second-guessing every turn, every decision. But Hristo wasn't on a hiking trail. One wrong step here meant a 10,000-foot fall into the abyss below. As the last traces of sunlight disappeared behind the jagged peaks and complete darkness swallowed the mountain, Hristo's world suddenly shrank to the small circle of light from his headlamp. For the next 3 hours, Hristo fought his way down that ridge in conditions that would have been challenging in daylight with a full team. In the dark, alone, it was like trying to navigate a minefield while blindfolded. Every step required him to test his footing, probe ahead with his ice axe, and pray that whatever he was stepping onto could actually hold his weight. By 9:10 p.m., Hristo found himself facing an impossible choice. He had managed to descend about 1,000 feet, or almost 305 meters from the summit. But he was still at 28,000 feet, or just over 8.5 kilometers in elevation, and the technical climbing ahead of him, in complete darkness, was getting more and more dangerous. Every few steps, he had to stop and figure out where the route went. His headlamp beam could only show him a few feet ahead, and beyond that was just black emptiness that could hide a cliff, loose rock, or a cornice that would collapse under his weight. He had two options, and both of them were terrible. He could keep trying to descend in the dark, risking a fall that would kill him instantly, or he could stop and do something mountaineers call a bivouac. Now, if you're not familiar with that term, a bivouac basically means spending the night outside without proper shelter. For most people, that might mean camping under the stars with a sleeping bag and maybe a tarp. Uncomfortable, but survivable. But at 28,000 feet on the west ridge of Everest, a bivouac means something completely exposed to hurricane-force winds and temperatures that can freeze your skin solid in minutes. It means trying to survive in an environment where your body is already slowly dying just from the altitude, and now you're asking it to endure a full night without shelter. That's when Hristo made the radio call that sealed his fate. I will bivouac because of darkness. He'd just committed himself to spending the night fighting for his life in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and he was going to do it completely alone. What happened next was 18 hours of pure survival horror. Now, we don't have a minute-by-minute account of that night because Hristo was completely alone, but we know enough about what the human body endures at that altitude to understand the nightmare he was living through. First came the cold, and I'm not talking about the kind of cold where you shiver and complain. This was cold that attacks your body like a living thing trying to kill you. Your breath turns to ice crystals that cut your throat. The metal of your climbing gear becomes so cold it can freeze to your skin on contact. And remember, Hristo had no tent, no sleeping bag, no shelter whatsoever. Just the down suit he was wearing and whatever windbreak he could find on that exposed ridge. He would have spent those hours in constant motion, flexing his fingers and toes, moving his arms and legs, anything to keep his blood flowing and prevent frostbite from setting in. Hour after hour, he sat there in the howling wind and bitter cold, waiting for a dawn that seemed like it would never come. Every few minutes, he probably had to make the conscious decision to keep fighting, to not give up, to not just let the cold take him. But somehow, impossibly, when the sun finally rose on April 21st, Hristo Prodanov was still alive. But alive and able to continue were two very different things. His teammates at base camp had spent the night knowing their colleague was trapped somewhere high on the mountain, with no shelter, desperate for any sign he'd survived. When his voice finally crackled through the radio that morning, they immediately knew something was terribly wrong. His voice was weak, barely audible, and when he tried to describe his condition, the words that came through would haunt them forever. "I have lost my gloves," Hristo whispered. "I cannot use my fingers." At those heights, losing your gloves is practically a death sentence. Your fingers become blocks of ice that can't bend, can't grip, can't function at all. Even worse, without working fingers, Hristo couldn't operate his climbing gear. He couldn't zip his jacket if he got too cold. He couldn't adjust his equipment. He couldn't even properly work his radio to call for help. Every basic survival function that required manual dexterity was now impossible. Throughout that day, April 21st, the radio calls kept coming, each one weaker than the last, each one more desperate. His teammates could hear him trying to describe his condition, but his voice was getting harder and harder to understand. The cold and altitude were shutting down his body piece by piece. By late afternoon, when he managed to key his radio one more time, the message was barely audible. "I cannot hold the radio button much longer." His fingers were so frozen that he could barely press the button to transmit. Soon, even that simple action would be impossible. Somewhere during those final transmissions, Hristo managed to say something that revealed just how hopeless his situation had become. "I see nobody to rescue me." Think about that for a moment. Here was a man who had spent his entire life calculating risks, analyzing problems, finding solutions. Even as he was dying, his engineer's mind was still working, still assessing his situation with brutal honesty. He knew someone might try to reach him, but he also understood the reality of where he was. At 28,000 feet, in conditions where rescue wasn't just difficult, it was impossible. At 5:30 p.m. on April 21st, Hristo's voice contact ceased completely, but his teammates weren't ready to give up. They kept calling his name over the radio, hoping, praying for some response. Then, at 7:45 p.m., they heard something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. One single click of his radio transmitter. No voice, no words, just one mechanical click, and then complete silence. That click meant Hristo was still alive, still conscious enough to reach for his radio, but he could no longer speak. He could no longer form words. All he could do was press that button one final time, a last desperate signal that said, "I'm still here." And then there was nothing. But here's the truly heartbreaking part. While Hristo was accepting that no rescue was possible, his teammate, Ludmil Yankov, was refusing to give up. Yankov had been listening to those desperate radio calls all day, and he made a decision that would either save his friend's life or cost him his own. He was going up after him. Now, what Yankov was attempting was essentially impossible. At 28,000 feet, every breath is a struggle. The cold can kill you in minutes. One wrong step and you are gone even faster. And he was planning to do this alone, at night, in a race against time, to reach someone who might already be dead. On April 21st, as Hristo's final radio transmissions were coming through, Yankov started climbing from Camp 3 at 23,500 feet. In a single superhuman push, he climbed over 1,000 vertical feet through conditions that would challenge a helicopter. By 9 p.m., Yankov had reached 28,000 feet, close to where Hristo was trapped. But the darkness and wind made it impossible to see anything. Hristo could have been 50 feet away, and Yankov would never have found him. What Yankov did next shows how desperate the situation was. He found shelter on a tiny ledge and spent the entire night at 27,500 feet, in the death zone, continuously shouting into his radio, "Don't fall asleep. You're a great man. Don't sleep. You're Bulgarian. People are running to you." For hours through that brutal night, Yankov's voice was crackling through Hristo's radio.
Окей, Христе, окей, Ито, окей. Разбирам те добре. Не говори. Не заспивай. Не заспивай. Не заспивай. Не заспивай. Не заспивай. Нице, ти си голям мъж си ти. Не заспивай, ти си българин.
But there was no response. By morning, Yankov had to face the horrible reality. Hristo was gone, but the mountain extracted its price from Yankov too. The extreme cold gave him frostbite so severe that when he finally made it back to base camp, 4 of his fingers had to be amputated. He'd sacrificed parts of his own body trying to save his teammate. Despite extensive searches over the following days, Hristo's body was never found. Yankov later said about his friend, he stayed forever at the peak, fused with his dream. But this story doesn't end there, because 20 years later, something impossible happened that would turn this tragedy into a family curse. It was May 2004. The spring climbing season was in full swing, and teams from all over the world had gathered on Everest's north side in Tibet. Among them was a small Bulgarian contingent led by Ivan Maslarov, head of the Bulgarian Federation of Alpine Clubs. With him was his wife, a woman wearing a bright red furry cap that stood out in every photograph taken at Advanced Base Camp. Her name was Mariana Prodanova Maslarova. She was Hristo's niece. She had come here with a single goal: to become the first Bulgarian woman to summit Mount Everest without supplemental oxygen, and to honor the uncle who had vanished on the mountain 20 years earlier. But from the moment she arrived, veteran climbers and Sherpas were uneasy. She climbed slowly, dangerously slowly, often trailing behind other climbers. On practice climbs, she had been giving oxygen to her Sherpa, something so alarming that expedition leaders began voicing concern. Mingma Dorje, one of the most respected Sherpas in the Himalaya, reportedly begged her not to push higher. Even Western teams intercepted her radio calls, shouting warnings, "Get her out of there." But Mariana's mind was made up. On May 18th, she left the North Col without her Sherpa or even her backpack, shocking those from below. And on May 21st, exactly 20 years and 30 days after Hristo vanished, she began her final push toward the summit. The wind tore across the north face as she left Camp 3 in the early hours. Her pace was painfully slow. It took 13 exhausting hours just to reach the second step at nearly 27,000 feet. By then, her struggle up the fixed ladder created a dangerous traffic jam, with radios crackling with frustration and alarm, but she kept climbing. Higher up, her movements became erratic. Climbers passing her reported she seemed detached, almost dreamlike, pointing toward the summit and saying just one word in a sing-song voice: "Summit." Her Sherpa, Mingma Dorje, who had stayed behind, had already warned she wasn't strong enough to be up there. Now, everyone watching from below could see it too. At that height, slipping out of sight doesn't take much. The ridge narrows, the wind cuts visibility to almost nothing, and climbers move like ghosts, too exhausted to do more than focus on survival. Mariana was completely alone. She had no Sherpa, no partner, and when darkness closed in, she was just another headlamp swallowed by the storm. A single step off the hard-packed trail, a stumble into drifted snow, and she was invisible. Only meters from the route, but beyond help. On Everest, you don't need to fall to disappear. You just have to stop moving. And somewhere above the second step, that's exactly what happened. Mariana simply vanished into the death zone's thin air. Days later, a Brazilian team climbing the north face would find her body frozen in place at that same altitude where her uncle had vanished 20 years before. The bright red cap made her instantly recognizable. To climbers on the mountain, it felt like Everest had closed a circle. Two members of the same family, bound by a shared dream, had been claimed by the same slope, as if her uncle's story had been written in advance for her too. Her body was never brought down. Like Hristo, Mariana Prodanova Maslarova remains on the mountain, a silent marker of devotion and obsession that went too far. When Hristo's story hit Bulgaria, the reaction was unprecedented. Hristo was posthumously named Hero of the People's Republic of Bulgaria and recognized as #1 Bulgarian mountaineer of the 20th century. His 1984 Everest ascent was voted Bulgarian sporting event of the 20th century by Bulgarian national television viewers. A statue of Hristo stands in his hometown of Karlovo. A school even bears his name. But here's what's really mind-blowing. The West Ridge direct route has remained completely unrepeated for 40 years since Hristo's expedition. Think about that. 40 years of advancing technology, improved equipment, better weather forecasting, and enhanced climbing techniques. Routes that were considered impossible in the 1980s are now climbed regularly by competent mountaineers. But the West Ridge Direct? Still one of the most dangerous routes on the mountain. Only 3 of 21 teams had succeeded on any West Ridge route as of 2000, making it statistically more difficult than K2. So how do we remember Hristo Prodanov? As the Bulgarian engineer who achieved the impossible on Everest's deadliest route? As a tragic figure whose ambition led him to attempt something no one else had dared repeat? Or as something far more complex? Let me know in the comments. Hristo Prodanov is still on Mount Everest today. His body will probably be there forever because the West Ridge is considered too dangerous for recovery operations. But he achieved his dream. He proved that determination and skill could overcome any obstacle, even if the price was ultimate. He died having lived his dream, rather than dying before he got the chance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Stay bold and live brave.